Hello, Paul, Uday, and Bhargav. This session is part of an internal training on analyzing critical issues by weeding out informational bias and media manipulation, especially by the West. Paul, we have seen how Western media outlets have managed to form biased narratives and shape public opinion in favor of their own government's agenda. Information obtained by this media is selectively presented and framed to elicit specific responses. This is evident, especially in the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. Paul, we will appreciate your insights about this as a training exercise for the team. And do you mind if I record this?
No, please go ahead. Okay, so look, firstly, I don't think that let's call it what it is. It's propaganda. And I'm not sure that it's there to elicit specific responses, as you mentioned. I think it's there to shape thinking. And in shaping the thinking, they're not looking for responses. They're looking for people to be compliant with what the governments are doing. And when I say that, obviously in democracies, governments are elected to represent the people, but they're actually not selected to utilise hundreds of millions of dollars of people's lives in the community to do what they think is good, regardless of how immoral it is. And I think there's a fundamental lack of accountability. Now, let's just put this in perspective too. China has a massive propaganda program going under Modi in India. He's actually got the whole media manipulated and owned and in his back pocket. So he's fooling the West, and the West is fooling everybody about their motives in the Ukraine and other conflicts, weapons of mass destruction being the most notable, but only one of thousands of examples. Now, the point there is that if we spoke fluent Mandarin, we would see the same problems in the Chinese press releases. I will say this as I'm looking at various official sites, various expert pundits, people that we've verified have an excellent degree of understanding of the Ukraine-Russia conflict, for instance. We see that the Russian side of the media releases are significantly better than the Western media releases. Now that's a very scary statement, but I think Bassel and Uday, particularly in your work, you'll have seen how they taint the language to suit what their own political motivations are. Bassel, could you think of one or two off the top of your head?
Yes, Paul, I would actually talk about the Ukrainian drone attacks inside Russia, because the Western media have been portraying it as a highly effective way of countering the Russian special operation in Ukraine. However, some other media, which is not Western, have claimed that Ukraine is still losing around 10,000 drones per month, and is not as effective as portrayed by Western media in Russia.
Yeah, and I think you'll see the Western media, it'll use softer language when the US NATO actions. They'll say, precision strikes when the US and NATO are being referred to, and when the Russians are being referred to with exactly the same type of weapon systems as referred to as indiscriminate bombing. And then you get very colourful language. I can't remember the exact detail. Perhaps you do, but it was an airstrike against, was it Chernihiv City? Can you remember that incident?
Yes, Paul. Actually, the headline was that the streets were stained with blood trails and strewn with scraps from first aid supplies that have been used to treat the wounded. So it's somehow dramatic of talking about the airstrike.
And if you look at which news source was that, probably something colourful and ratings based. Was it Reuters, perchance?
Yes, it was Reuters.
So I don't know what language that is, Reuters, but perhaps It should actually be called ratings, because it seems to be that their motivation is about getting the people that have already been successfully programmed by their government and giving them what they need to see to meet what they think is their very morally superior, clear understanding of the scenario. So Reuters and many other news agencies then pitch at that. Another example was an airstrike against the Surrey oil field that killed 3 guards, damaged an oil pipeline in that region, and the Western media's comment was, Libya says NATO airstrike hits major oil field. Can you remember that one?
Yes, I remember that as well, Paul. It was from Reuters as well.
Okay, so what can we read into that when we're talking about bias?
Well, we can say that if there is an airstrike by the NATO or US, Western media starts to try to make it look better rather than an airstrike which is by Russia, where it makes it more dramatic and try to point fingers about what the Russian airstrike or missile strike or drone strike have done to civilians on ground.
That's right. So they're playing it down, right? Airstrike hits major oil field versus stained with blood trails, strewn with scraps from first aid supplies. Now, what does this do? So obviously we then have to, in our processes of databasing and analysis, we use the Admiralty system and we rate the specific source and the publication. But when you see a totally conflicting use of language, how would you then look to rate Reuters? Would you give them 5 out of 5 for always reliable and always dependable, or where would you rate them numerically in terms of the Admiralty scale?
Well, I think with what we've been seeing for the past year, since the start of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, I think the credibility and the reliability of this information way goes down beyond 2 even.
Yeah, so look, I'll be blunt. My rating for Reuters is 1, which basically means I don't read it. Okay, there's just no point, unless I want to have a giggle and remind myself how appalling some of the Western media is, then I don't read it. It's purely entertainment value. It really probably should be in cartoon books and sold next to the sporting pages, because there is no analysis. It's just sensationalist jargon and junk, really. Look, I think when we're looking at bias, we all have bias. We all have a tendency to lean to the left or to the right, or be pro-Western or pro-Eastern. Obviously, our job is to cut out that bias. So that Admiralty rating system, it's just critical. We obviously are an analytical company, and what's our mission, Uday?
Is to help our clients make timely risk management decisions.
That's right. And to do that, we have to sort through our subconscious biases, but we then need to rate all the various sources we use. And if we look at releases by foreign affairs departments, if we look at releases by governments, if we look at presidential officers' releases, if we look at the media releases, we all have to then look through that language and ask ourselves, what is the truth here? And if we just talk through, for example, the head of the Wagner group getting killed, how many media sources basically just jumped straight out and said, Putin done it. Okay, but if we think that through, who else could have done it? And who else has particularly strong motives for doing it? Bhargav?
Paul, it could be the Western Alliance as well, especially when they are afraid of redeployment of Wagner Group in Baltic states or even in Ukraine for that matter. So it would be a smokescreen by putting all the blame on the administration in Moscow.
Yep, that's one possibility. And if you look at, this is a bit of a conspiracy as opposed to a piece of analysis, but for just discussing through the evaluation process, let's say Western intelligence agencies had lined up the failed coup, and then it wasn't successful, and they feared that the head of Wagner may talk. Okay, now a second option would be, where do you think, would Poland have a motivation?
Yes, so Poland's obvious motivation is to protect its borders, and there is deployment of troops along Polish borders in Belarus. So it is directly threatened by such deployments, and it may think that a direct solution is to take out the head of the group responsible for such deployments.
Exactly right. And who else was killed in there? Not just Goza. Who else was killed in that?
The founder of Wagner Group. Sorry, the name escapes my memory.
Yep. And Gozan's 2IC and 8 of his senior management. Okay.
Yes.
Now, is it also conceivable that in a wartime they're racing around, maintenance wasn't good, and it was an accident? Is that also an option?
That is probably an option. At the same time, I would add one more point there. As a protocol, many institutions, both corporate and government, have a policy that the top management do not travel together in the same airline. So it could be a lapse of such protocol.
Well, yes, but let's keep on the track here. Okay, I agree with you, but we're going off track, mate. The question is, could it have been an accident? So we're looking at the various options rather than just going, Putin done it, all solved, right? Let's persecute Putin again. The big man with the Satan fork and horns. Could it have been an accident?
Yes, Paul. It could be an accident.
Okay, so Bassel, then if we're outlining other options besides Putin done it, what would we then have to do in terms of our analysis? We would have to look at various outlets, various language, and then we would need to give a weighting on the probability rather than pretend we know, like most Western media outlets are doing. But what sort of terms we would use in terms of the options as to the probability?
Well, Paul will try to use other
Would I help him out?
media outlets rather than Western ones.
Yeah, we've sort of gone through that, but we wouldn't just use media outlets, would we? We'd also look at official information releases by who?
By government agencies that kept.
Correct. Yeah, just hang on a second, Bassel. You're sort of 3 rucks behind the rugby game at the moment. Go ahead, Uday.
So we'd collect data from multiple sources, and then we'd evaluate.
That's right. And the least likely we're going to be evaluating is media sources, because we've just gone through it, Bassel, that Reuters is about as reliable as a 97-year-old opening batsman in Test cricket, mate. So how would we then go about and look at various potential scenarios of the cause of the plane crash? How would we then indicate to clients where we're tending to think are the most probable? What sort of terminology would we use, would it?
Scenarios and indicators, Paul. So we look at the kind of indicators for each scenario, for example, an accident or Russia shooting Moscow ordering the attack or the West ordering the attack. And we'd see the likely indicators for each of them. We'd see the kind of factors that would support these scenarios, and then we'd present this to clients with the most likely scenario on top.
That's exactly right. So that's what I'm probing for. Most likely, less likely, and unlikely, or possible, okay? And then we would, of course, look at establishing, as you mentioned, indicators and measuring against those indicators, though we tend to use that not necessarily for something that just was unpredictable. We use that for scenarios that are unfolding, okay?
Yeah.
We don't tend to use indicators as a benchmark. We just go straight into the analytical process when there's an unforeseen, unpredictable, sudden onset of an event like this, okay?
Yeah.
All right. So the key takeaway, though, Basil, is if we know media's junk, we can't allow it to get into the database, okay? Media comments after the Kakhovka Dam attack with Ukraine and Russia blamed each other. Russia had means, motive, and opportunity to destroy the Ukraine dam. Drone photos and information show. And then how did that actually unfold? What was the end result? Where's it at now? Does anyone recall?
I think, Paul, there was a scenario where Ukraine would have benefited more than Russia in destroying the Kakhovka Dam.
Well, you actually go and check it out after this call, because I think actually somebody claimed responsibility for it, mate, okay? That's always a great piece of analysis to get the statement of the people that claim responsibility for it, okay?
Yes, sure, Paul.
All right, so guys, the key takeaway that I want you to note from this little training exercise is if you note the database, we're utilising the Admiralty system, a rating of 1 to 5 on the reliability of the sources and therefore the reliability of the information. If we look at media sources, once they get below 3, we can no longer trust them to look at situations other than an early warning on an event. But once you've got the early warning on the event, then our analysis needs to go to reliable government officials, and when it's in the areas where we've got our own people and our own networks, of course, that's always the better way to go, because then we're 100% certain that there's no side agendas manipulating the information for various political or commercial agendas. All right, any questions or points you'd like to add, Basil?
No, nothing from my end, Paul. Thank you.
Okay, I think it's important that the media simplifies US motives in conflicts. It emphasises liberation or security while portraying opposition, Russia and Chinese in particular, as they're there for expansionist or malevolent reasons. But the reality is that America has been the catalyst for more wars in the last 50 years than any other nation. Notably, it hasn't done well in those wars. Yes, they had a massive input with their industrial might into World War I and World War II, but they do forget how many people's lives lost, how many nations had sacrificed everything before they graced us with their presence. But I think it's really important that we actually, as a part of our geopolitical analysis, which is the basis for everything we're doing for regional and country risk decisions being made by our multinational clients, that we have to ensure that we're continuing to really scrutinise any media sources that we're utilising, and making sure that we update our acceptable source lists, and making sure that we're on top of the actual databasing so that the Admiralty system is being enforced. And Bhargav, perhaps yourself and I need to have a separate session with the people that are doing the database entry to make sure that they're also doing a second tier ruthless implementation a ruthless check and implementing that ruthless check to make sure that the analysts don't get lazy or don't act too quickly and try to get information in the database, because that database we have has to be a critical value add and we can't afford to weaken that, okay?
That's well noted. Will do.
All right, Uday, any final questions or points, mate?
Just one point, Paul, to add to what you're saying about media and its narratives, I think having some historical context, as you did indicate, would be helpful. America lost Vietnam and it caused that, the weapons of mass destruction, Libya, Afghanistan, the airstrikes at the Kabul airport for after the bombing over there. Bhargav could cover off on this, but basically the US hit a family of civilians and
Yes.
that was called collateral damage. So that was it.
Yes, and the number of times they've gone to war without, UN Security Council sign off. I mean, ultimately, it's hegemonic power that believes it does everything because of its own belief in its own exceptionalism and its own belief in superior morality. But when you look critically at killing civilian families and saying it's collateral damage, but if anyone else does it, it's a human rights abuse and a war crime, ultimately, doesn't matter who you are, including if you're the hegemonic power of the world, if you lose credibility, you lose credibility. And I mean, ultimately, we're seeing now that the combined membership of the forever growing BRICS is bigger than the G7. It won't be long before it's bigger than the G20. China's already bigger on a purchasing power parity basis than the US. It won't be long before it's a nominal leader. Ultimately, America is not adjusting its behaviours in line with the fact that it's losing hegemonic power, and it's not actually adjusting to the loss of hegemonic power is inevitable. And so it really does need to change the way it interacts with the world, but it's not. And so that has massive flow-on effects to all the analysis we do, because there's a lot of hyperbole in their attempts to manipulate power, but they've had so many failures to do wars well, to do post-war peace well, to do post-war development well. And so they've lost their moral high ground, unfortunately, because the world needs America to be what it was 30, 40 years ago, the moral leader, but it just seems to have lost its way. And of course, China, on the other hand, is expanding itself. It's really projecting itself a lot more diplomatically, projecting itself. And everyone, when I'm saying that, you're all thinking Belt and Road Initiative. That's not what I'm referring to solely. I'm referring to their ability to chair meetings and be respected as the chair of the meeting, to have bilateral meetings. If we look at what they're doing now in the Wa state and helping lead Thailand, Myanmar, and Laos to do operations with the Myanmar State Army, the Wa State Army, to go and capture various crime syndicates operating cyber scams and various scamming operations. They're showing a lot more leadership that's acceptable, particularly to the developing countries, and they seem to have lost their way with the inefficiencies that the large organisations with names commencing with World or International or United, they seem to be just losing their way a bit in terms of having objectives and missions, but then utilising them for political tools and political outcomes rather than for the actual stated mission of those various enormous international organisations. So, Bassel, I'd like you to just consolidate what we've discussed today, just, maybe 2/3 of the page, 3 or 4 headings and bullet points, because I want you to, and Uday, to propagate it to the team and have a separate session on this after you've all absorbed this particular session, okay?
Yes, sure, Paul, I'll do that.
All right. Thank you, Uday. Bhargav, anything to add?
Paul, just another question for you, a larger question rather. This is primarily comes with the context of the ugly drama what the West does, especially the US, about framing public opinion, giving primacy to democratic system and whatnot. When the media does its job and exposes some of the scams, to what extent do you think it is effective in forming those public opinion critical of their own governments? I mean, as an Australian, similar things have leaked into the press in Australia as well, which is very much in cahoots with the US and the NATO allies. Does that actually affect their standing within a so-called democratic system?
Look, I think we're going to see that in the next American election. I think the lack of leadership, the lack of objective fairness, the fact that NATO is being used as a warmongering entity that is destabilising Europe, has decimated Ukraine, has led to the killing of the male fighting population, total destruction of families, total destruction of infrastructure, the total meltdown in Afghanistan, the sudden withdrawal. I think the good thing about democracy is that change of power can be effected very easily and very peacefully, but I think it's got to a point in the States where it doesn't matter whether it's red or blue in power, the public service and the politicians and the various financial entities that manipulate them mean that it only changes and brings optimism on the short term, but on the longer term, there's no real change. And that's the problem for America, because I think now the next election, I think we're going to see significant civil unrest, because I don't think that people think they're getting the facts, and all the media's manipulated, and that's what's leading to making it very easy for controversial figures like Trump to raise the emotional stakes. Everybody's on edge. We saw that with rallying to the arms and the invasion of Capitol Hill. I don't think those problems are going away. I think it's just escalating and the pressure's building. I think it's different in Australia. People are not yet politically mature. Aussies are actually more concerned about their football team and drinking beer on a Friday night and making sure that they do a 15-hour work week but get paid for 50. So I don't think they've got the same pressures emerging, but there's certainly the same problem there. Australia's just, it hasn't matured, so people aren't really analysing their own media or politicians. They're still very much the mushrooms. They're in the dark and fed the fertiliser. And I don't think they actually understand what's going on. The big tracts of the American population do know what's going on. And sadly for America, I think that's going to be a real issue come the next election. And I don't think it's going to be resolved anytime soon. I think we can see continuing and escalating civil unrest at election time and beyond, starting with this next election, which follows on from the previous election. To answer your question, Bhargav?
Yes, Paul, most certainly. Sometimes I really wonder to what extent are civil societies in some of the Western countries impervious to some of the exposures or exposes made by the media. For example, between 2002 and 2020, there have been more than 10,000 deaths by drone attacks. But if we go by the official figures, more than 2,000 of them were civilians. And this doesn't seem to have moved civil society organizations in the US or in the West to any extent against multiple governments, Republican or Democrat for that matter. So that was a very pertinent answer, Paul. Thank you.
Yeah, look, and I think just to add to that, Bhargav, I think this concept of the West, not only America, but the entire Five Eyes and the West and certainly Western Europe, they actually think they're exceptional. They think that they're superior. They think their morals and systems should be superimposed over all other cultures. And I mean, that's as daft and stupid and as arrogant as it seems. But it's there, it exists. So this belief that one culture and one political and economic system is superior is clearly a flawed premise. And I think that's going to play out in Europe. I think certain elements of the European society are going to see that actually NATO's not there for peace. NATO's not there to spread Russia's expansion. It's there to spread the West's expansion, and that this war was unnecessary if it wasn't pushed onto the borders of, if NATO didn't expand and try to take on membership. It should have been called the anti-Russian pro-American organisation rather than NATO, because clearly NATO is misplaced in its belief that it can actually just expand and get any other treatment other than what was an inevitable. You can't go setting up American out nuclear missile sites across Europe, pushing onto their border and think there's not going to be a reaction, and then blaming Russia for invading Ukraine. I mean, ultimately, as society gets educated, it's going to lead to civil unrest in Europe. People are going to question, was the war necessary? Was inflation necessary? Was the inflated oil and gas prices necessary? Germany's going to start to ask, well, what happened to that pipeline and our cheap energy? What's happening to our industry? Why are we being depowered as a global superpower? How have we gained from this? Why are we always standing up alongside America when we're disadvantaged and they're not? So I think these questions are going to play out, and I think it's going to be fascinating. And I think we just need to make sure that we're really critically looking at media sites and rating our sources and never losing sight of, if they have a bad day, they're probably a bad editor. And if they're a bad editor, they're probably working for a bad organisation. And if they're a bad organisation in the media game, we need to make sure we're not reading their drivel. Okay.
Totally, Paul.
As entertaining as it may be. All right, gents, thanks very much. Cheerio.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.